Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the Marx Chair of Western Hemisphere Studies at Baruch College and a professor of political science here at the Graduate Center. As a note to all our participants, we are recording the event. So please stay muted unless you are asking a question. And also be aware that we will be recording this and then posting this as a live stream on the Builder Center's website. Across the Americas, countries as diverse as the United States, Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, El Salvador have elected populist leaders on both the left and the right who have posed significant challenges to democratic order and the rule of law. Countries throughout the region have also faced meaningful challenges building equitable economies and confronting chronically elevated criminal violence due to robust illicit markets and ready access to firearms. Perhaps nowhere in the Americas do these various dynamics come together more so than in Brazil, though the same can be said of a number of other countries that are facing similar challenges. From 2002 to 2016, Brazil was led by the Workers' Party under the administrations of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from 2002 to 2010 and Dilma Rousseff from 2010 to 2016. This unprecedented period of center-left rule in Brazil achieved various things, including the Bolsa Família conditional cash transfer program, which contributed to reductions in the high levels of inequality in that country, the Fome Zero hunger reduction program, the establishment of further funds to education in the country, the expansion of federal universities, the establishment of a public housing program known as Minha Casa Minha Vida, and expansions in investment in other sectors of the economy. These programs pushed Brazil in new directions. The PT, the Workers' Party administrations, also gave the federal police unprecedented space to investigate corruption among Brazil's elite. Despite these very real accomplishments, the PT also found itself mired in various scandals during their leadership of the country, including the Mensalão and post office scandal. The most important of these eventually emerged was the Lava Jato scandal, or the car wash scandal, which was related to money laundering and kickback schemes, and eventually implicated and led to the arrest of President da Silva. During its years in office, the PT developed relationships of political convenience with centrist parties that supported its legislative agenda amid chronic protest movements, economic downturn, and pressure over ongoing corruption investigations. These parties realigned with Brazil's right to impeach President Rousseff and install Vice President Michel Temer of the PMDB in power in 2016. Brazil's woes, however, were not easily resolved. In 2018, Brazil elected Jair Bolsonaro, a longtime member of Congress, as president. Mr. Bolsonaro had been a military officer during the 1964 to 1985 military dictatorship and had long held various right-wing views. He was involved, and members of his family have been linked politically to right-wing militias in Rio de Janeiro, violent, often police-connected extortion rackets, an issue that has been borne out by journalism in his years since taking office. His leadership of the country has been contentious. He has spurred division in the country by targeting disadvantaged groups, particularly women, members of the LGBTQ community, Afro-Brazilians, and indigenous peoples. In his first years in office, he cut funding to monitoring deforestation in the Amazon, prompting increases in deforestation, took actions that facilitated gun ownership. He adopted a politics of minimizing COVID and the national response to COVID, though state and local governments often stepped in with more vigorous responses. He has had a contentious relationship with the military, dismissing those he sees as opponents and seeking to put allies in the military in power. This year, the October election is shaping up as a race between Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Jair Bolsonaro. To discuss this election and its implications for democracy and the future of democracy in Brazil, we have two leading experts on Brazilian politics with us today. First is Daniela Campello, an associate professor of politics and international affairs at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. In the 21-22 academic year, she is a resident fellow at the Wilson Center for International Scholars. Her research lies at the frontier of international and comparative political economy with a particular focus on the consequences of globalization for domestic politics in emerging economies. Her research has been published in leading political science journals, and she is the author of The Politics of Market Discipline in Latin America and a co-author of The Volatility Curves, both published by Cambridge University Press. Amy Erika Smith is an associate professor of political science and liberal arts and sciences, dean's professor at Iowa State University. In the 2020 to 2022 academic years, she is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her research examines citizenship, democracy, and religion with a primary focus on Latin America and especially Brazil. She is the author of Religion and Brazilian Democracy, Mobilizing God's People, published by Cambridge University Press, as well as many articles in academic outlets and public media. So thank you to both of you for joining us, and to the audience. So to set the table, I wanted to ask you both, 6 months out from the first round of the 2022 general elections, how do you see the political situation in the country? Professor Campello, can you start us out?
Yes, sure. How do I see? As a scholar and student of political economy and economic voting, I see the elections as relatively clear in terms of their results. I believe that Bolsonaro stands very little chance of being reelected right now. The economy in Brazil has been doing really badly. We have high inflation, high unemployment, low growth, inflation of food, which are basic things that people need, that poor people need. So he's in very bad shape right now. What he's doing to try to boost his chances is to spend the money that he doesn't have. So we have now what we call the secret budget, which is money that is in the hands of the president of the Congress and can be spent without any transparency. Nobody knows where the money is going. So that's an attempt, a last attempt to boost his chances, with no success, because the more he spends, the harder it is for investors to trust the economy. We have depreciation of the currency and more inflation. So we are in this cycle right now. The last numbers show that 62% of the people in Brazil would not vote for him and believe that Lula will be elected. So in terms of the electoral results, I think even though Bolsonaro has the money, has the budget, and has been spending it all, and we know that presidents in Brazil tend to be reelected, so all of them were, so this is not something to be ignored. But if we compare the popularity and the support that Bolsonaro has right now in the beginning of the electoral year with any other president that managed to become reelected, he's in very bad shape. He has he's about half the popularity of Dilma, who had the least of all. So in that sense, it's fine. Well, what I'm concerned right now, and very concerned, is with Bolsonaro messing it up and trying to follow Trump's steps. He has been signaling very clearly that it is what he's going to do. And differently from the US, Bolsonaro has the military with him, not officially, not openly, but even the specialists on the military cannot say that they wouldn't join Bolsonaro in an adventure. So this is a major concern right now. And I think that the closer he gets to Lula, the most probable it is that he does something like this. I hope that with the higher margin, he doesn't go very far. So in terms of electoral, I'm not concerned with him not winning the election, but I'm very concerned with what he can do in discrediting the election, saying that it's not fair, and trying to play Trump's game in Brazil.
Thank you, Professor Campello. Professor Smith, how do you see this election year shaping up?
Okay, so I want to start off by pointing out an assumption in your question. So your question starts out 6 months from the first round of the 2022 general election, which assumes that the election is going to a second round. So the Brazilian elections have historically gone to, or presidential elections have historically gone to 2 rounds. we are in fact almost exactly 6 months out from the second round of the 2022 general election. Where the first round will be October 2nd, the second round, assuming there it goes to a second round, which means that assuming nobody wins 50% outright in the first round, the second round will be October 23rd. So yeah, so we do, I mean, so we are 6 months out from the second round general election. So assuming we go to a second round, that means that that Lula is unlikely to win 50% in the first round general election. I try to avoid prognosticating, and I can't predict the future, but it does seem relatively likely that Lula isn't going to win 50% in the first round, but I wouldn't entirely count it out either. The polls have been clear that Lula is a front runner from the very beginning, and will continue to be the front runner. I'd say overwhelmingly, as I sat down to try to jot out my thoughts to answer your question, was that we have a situation of deja vu all over again. Brazilian politics tends to keep repeating itself in these cycles of things that you see, I mean, the same story over and over again with, new themes, no nuances, and yet really very old political patterns. For instance, Lula da Silva as the front runner in this election, Lula or a proxy for Lula has been the front runner in every election for at least 2 decades. Lula was a front runner, in fact, in 2018 until he was disqualified. And so Lula's presence as a front runner is one of the oldest stories in contemporary Brazilian politics, in fact. And the coalition of forces aligning behind Lula da Silva, likewise, it's an old story, lots of old players, some new party names, but that even new party names is something that one comes to expect. Likewise, on the right, less of a consistent pattern over time, but Bolsonaro again for a second election in a row, heading up the right. And then we see the centrist players, both old historical centrist players and newer centrist players, again, as the kingmakers, as lining up with both left and right. So Geraldo Alckmin lining up, Lula's former opponent, now coming onto Lula's ticket as sort of a center to left coalition. And on the right as well, we have other centrist politicians. So a lot of deja vu. We also see similar structural conditions that keep repeating themselves. The role of transfers to the poor and what Brazilians call physiological spending, clientelistic spending. So we have Bolsonaro very clearly attempting to use spending for the poor, transfers to the poor, in order to boost his electoral chances. In addition to other things such as a secret budget, expenditure on everything from Viagra to robots, to try to anything he can get. Penis enhancements. The Brazilian news is full right now of stories about the things that money is being spent on. So we see public sector spending as a structural condition of Brazilian politics, utilized consistently over time to try to build political support, and likewise the military as a question mark in Brazilian politics. Though here this is something somewhat newer, in that the military were thought to have retreated from politics, and now once again we see very clearly since 2016 we see the role of the military as a question mark in Brazilian politics that can't be counted out, whose loyalties can't be counted out. In terms of issues, the economy is very clearly against Bolsonaro. And we know Daniela's work and the work of other scholars, it's very clear that the economy is incredibly important in Brazilian politics and Brazilian political elections, and the economy is against Bolsonaro. And this is above anything else, the reason. So this is a continuity in Brazilian politics that the economy, without the economy, it's very hard to win an election. This is the cause of his low popularity, or one of the causes of his low popularity. He has other causes of his low popularity as well. And the economy is unlikely to improve before this second round election, almost exactly 6 months from today. There are other issues coming back into play again. To some extent, the role of welfare policy, we're going to revisit. Once again, deja vu, we're going to revisit the role of what's called the expenditure ceiling, or the teto de gastos. So it's it's a cap on, it's a fiscal cap on the public sector budgets. So we're going to revisit this in the current election, likely. The PT is going to make this into an issue. The PT is also going to make the environment into an issue, it appears, in this election. So these are old issues that are going to come back. One of the interesting things is that perhaps the biggest new issue, no, certainly the biggest new issue of the past several years has been COVID, where we had one of the major sources of Bolsonaro's low popularity in the past several years has been his abysmal performance on COVID, where he has been decidedly outside of the mainstream of what the Brazilian public wants. And there, I'm less convinced that COVID is going to make a big difference at the end of the day in 2022, except for kind of long-term public perception that he's out of touch with what the public wants. But COVID is receding to some extent. I mean, it's still an issue, but it is less of an issue than it was before. Yeah, so overall, I see so many continuities from the past 2 decades of Brazilian politics. The big question mark, again, this is deja vu, that's standing out for all of us right now is, again, what's going to happen with the possibility of a political rupture. I personally think it's unlikely that we're going to have a democratic rupture, but this is a question that nobody can answer definitively right now. And that is in itself one of the problems.
Thank you.
Desmond, if I can add something, that's very interesting, a way to put it, the continuities of the elections, and there are many, actually. I think there's a few points. One, just to strengthen the story of the military, because this is very new. We never, ever have been, after redemocratization, concerned about what the military think and what they're going to do with the election. The other day, Lula was consulting with the military to ask whether everything will be fine if he won the election. This is absolutely unique and new after redemocratization. The Supreme Court in Brazil invited a general to be part of the commission that watches for transparency in the elections. And I think the intention was to outsmart Bolsonaro and try to prevent any claims of fraud, except for the fact that they picked one general that supposedly was trustworthy, and the guy said no. And now there's an open spot for a new general who nobody knows who's going to be, and is going to be watching the election and and assuring transparency to the election. So there is an interested part, which is the military, who are on the side of Bolsonaro, responding for transparency in the election. The other thing that I think that's interesting in this framework of continuity and change is the disappearance of right-wing parties. So that we had the PT forever running for the elections, but we had the PSDB on the other side, and now we have nothing. So we don't have candidates. So people have been talking about this third way, that it's just a discussion at the media. It doesn't exist politically. But more important than that, there's no party on the other side. It just disappeared. And I don't know what's going to be of the Brazilian political system without decent structured parties on the right from now on. So that's a concern for the future.
So I'd like to follow up on this question and stay with Professor Campello initially, and then go back to Professor Smith. So how has the Bolsonaro administration changed politics in Brazil since 2018? We've been talking about continuities, but let's talk a little bit about changes since then and reflect a little bit on how things have changed since then.
Okay, a lot has changed. I'd first say that Bolsonaro, you started introducing him as a populist leader. Bolsonaro is by the book a populist leader. So I changed the way that we talk about politics in Brazil. So now there are no opponents, we have enemies. He speaks directly as a representative of the people, the will of the people, like move back to Getúlio Vargas' discourse. It's amazing, he incorporates the will of the people. He absolutely doesn't respect institutions. This is very new. There was respect to the institutions during the PT, there was respect to the institutions during the PSDB, there's none anymore. And he discredits any rule of horizontal accountability. So this is a major concern. It started as with a neoliberal agenda that amazingly investors believed that was true, but Bolsonaro is a nationalist, he's a protectionist, he's not into neoliberal economics. So the one little side of his agenda that was not completely populist in terms of like spending it all, now it is. So he's spending it all as any populist you would imagine do. In Congress, I think what's new is that Bolsonaro started with this idea of not conceding to the give and take as a reference to what the PT did. So for the first 2 years, he did not have a governing coalition, and he learned during the 2 years that this is not something you can do in Brazilian politics. So if the agenda was stalled, except for the Social Security reform that was ran by the leader of the Congress, was not about the Bolsonaro government at all. It shouldn't be considered like some achievement of the government because it was not from the executive. And then after he managed to elect the president of the Congress, then things changed. So now he's more influential in rule making. So for example, in terms of environment, they have been trying to, not only like mining indigenous land and changing land property and all that. This has been going through the Congress. So now he learned how to do that. And I think that the reason why he was concerned about that is not that he had an agenda to pursue, but he was concerned about impeachment and he was concerned about his family being investigated. So then he changed in the second half of the government, but differently from the PSDB and from the PT that governed with the Centrão, the physiological parties, he governs, the Centrão is the government. It's not Bolsonaro anymore. So now we have this institution of the secret budget, which gives all the power in the hands of the leader of the Congress. And now we're even speaking about semi-presidentialism, which is the way to institutionalize what's going on right now. I think another very important point in terms of how he governs, he has a strategy. It's important to say, this was not a right turn in Brazilian politics. It's natural to have changes in partisanship and changes in ideology. And if people decided to vote for a right-wing government, they should have a right-wing government. So it's not about that. It's not that the agenda changed. The institutions they cannot follow their constitutional role anymore after Bolsonaro. So we have, in terms of executive institutions, he started questioning data, challenging how honest was the information that the institutions were providing, like with the deforestation institution was the first one. And he has a strategy of defund, change the leadership, put new leaders who are not only non-committed with the mission of the institution, like in the case of indigenous populations, or we have an institution that fights racism in Brazil and now has a black guy who is a racist, who said that slaves benefited from slavery in Brazil. So he changed the leadership towards people that really disrespect the goals of the institution. So these three things together, like defunding, changing leadership, and questioning data and discrediting, this happened very strongly in many executive institutions in Brazil. On the side of our horizontal accountability, the Attorney General he's in Bolsonaro's pockets. So there's absolutely nothing, any accusation that has been made against Bolsonaro has moved forward because of this guy. The federal police for Bolsonaro changed the leadership of the federal police. So now only investigations that work against his opponents move forward. The investigations against his own family are stalled. armed forces, as we said, the military and the military police were funded. The military were exempted from the social security reform, so they never suffered the cuts that the other categories suffered in Brazil. And of course, they are on Bolsonaro's side. The attacks on the media, if you see any reports from Reporters Without Borders, attacks on the media, on journalists, and revealing information, personal information of journalists, and trying to threaten them. And transparency. In the end, this is something that we never thought it would be possible. It's amazing to see that, for example, if Bolsonaro has meetings with people that he doesn't want us as the public citizens to know, he just says, well, that's a secret for 100 years. So whether like lobbyists go visit Bolsonaro, he establishes that's a secret for 100 years. We're going to learn in 100 years. So there's absolutely no concern with transparency. He tested all the institutions. He has been testing very strongly, and I think he won most of them. There's very little resistance right now to Bolsonaro. The Supreme Court may be the last, our last attempt to resist his attacks on democracy. So that was a major, I think one of the messages I'd like to leave is that Bolsonaro is not capable of many things. He's very limited cognitively. He could not even create a party with all the resources he has, but we've learned that it does not take a genius to destroy things. So he was very efficient in doing that.
Professor Campello, I just wanted to follow up on one point to make sure that everybody in the audience is familiar with this. Could you talk a little bit about the secret budget and what you mean by that term?
Okay, what I mean is when we have the budgets in Brazil, and of course there's a negotiation with the parties that support the government, and they get more funds, and that's part of this. So there's some exchange of voting and political support for funds for legislators, and this is part of the game, and everybody knows that. What Bolsonaro did was to create what we call, I don't know how to say it in English, emenda do relator. So he gives an amount of money. Do you have a name for that, Amy?
I think it's a speaker's amendment, maybe, or not speaker. Relator would be not speaker, but anyway,
anyway, so he gives an amount of budget that goes to the hands of the president of the lower house.
Maybe it is speaker. I think it is speaker.
Yeah, and then this amount of money can be distributed by the leader to legislators without any. We don't have any track of where this money goes to which legislator to do what. So this is something very, very new. It happened in the 90s. There was a corruption scandal in the Brazilian Congress that was related to this lack of transparency on expenditures. But after that, it was very well respected. The idea that we need, there are lots of negotiations involving the budget as in any Congress, but we knew where the money was spent. Right now, it's a big question mark. So the Supreme Court tried to push the Congress to provide some data on that. So far as I know, the time limit for providing this information has been gone, and we don't know where the money is being spent. And you have like Congress people from the north of Brazil spending money in the south of Brazil. We lost track where the budget is going in Brazil.
Great, thank you, Professor Campello. So Professor Smith, how do you see Brazil having changed in the 4 years since President Bolsonaro came to power?
Sorry, you would think that by now I would know to unmute myself. So yes, I've been thinking a lot about this as I've been listening to Danny talk. I'm going to start though with something that we haven't talked about first of all, or much. It's underlying a lot of what both of us have said, but is this on a rhetorical level, both the Bolsonaro administration's linkage to far-right religious and ideological leaders. So I think that this is one of the things that has been most unusual about his presidency, is this link to sort of a perceived global far-right that has historically just not really had a place in Brazilian politics. Through his guru, Olavo de Carvalho, who's a far-rightist pundit who made a name for himself through YouTube, lots and lots and lots and lots of YouTube videos, plus a whole bunch of books that he published, laying out this sort of far rightist ideological view, and Bolsonaro and his clan, meaning his children and assorted followers, all adopted Olavo de Carvalho as their quote unquote guru. And he became really rose to prominence in Brazilian politics through his linkage to the Bolsonaro clan. And this is Olavo de Carvalho, who passed away earlier this year, is just one of the one of the many instances in which the Bolsonaro administration has linked itself to far rightist views that just did not have a place on the Brazilian political spectrum. And this includes religious leaders, though Olavo de Carvalho is a far rightist Catholic and was not particularly religious, though he had I think he had relatively strong religious views, but he was not particularly associated as being a religious leader. But there have also been various evangelical leaders who have strongly taken Bolsonaro's side in sort of a culture war within Brazilian politics. And I would say these, I said that these are rhetorical linkages. They're linkages which have been felt in replacement of personnel in certain ministries, in a number of ministries, actually. These, this sort of, the ideological wing, as they call it, of the Bolsonaro administration has gotten control of some ministries. But I would say the sort of the feeling of it, the presence of it is maybe stronger than the impact on policy. Though the impact on, it has had, this ideological wing has had impact in certain kinds of policies, I think particularly for instance, with respect to the environment. So again, the rollback of environmental regulations and policies under Bolsonaro has largely been the result of his alliances with the Centrão, the center right, which really wanted to eliminate those environmental regulations. So I'd say that sort of link to a group that didn't have a place before is one major place where we see change. His ties to the military. Well, I was talking earlier about continuity, and I would say that the military started to become a threatening force in Brazilian politics around the time that there was a movement for Dilma Rousseff's impeachment. So we had, by the time Bolsonaro was running, there had been concern about how the military would respond to Dilma Rousseff's impeachment or lack thereof. There was concern that the military really wanted her impeachment. And that the military might have responded badly if she hadn't ultimately been impeached. So we see the resurgence of the power of the military as potentially a political kingmaker, a force that needs to be reckoned with in electoral politics. And Bolsonaro's increasing attempt to rely on the military in part to compensate for his institutional weaknesses in other ways, including his initial lack of support within Congress. We also see changes in the role of the Supreme Court. On the one hand, the Supreme Court has been an exceptionally, unusually powerful actor under Bolsonaro in some senses in terms of resisting him. The Supreme Court has at times taken a really political role in resisting Bolsonaro's encroachments on the other branches. At times when Congress has been more reluctant to act, the Supreme Court has at times really stood up to resist Bolsonaro. And then the other thing I was thinking about, though, as I was listening to Danny talk, was that the Supreme Court has been really very powerful in trying to resist Bolsonaro at certain moments during his administration. And at the same time, I think the story, for instance, of the secret budget in Congress is really that the Supreme Court came out against the secret budget and ruled that the secret budget was unconstitutional and demanded increased accountability from Bolsonaro. And it's not clear that the Supreme Court ruling is being respected, and it's not clear that there's anything that can be done about the fact that the Supreme Court ruling is not being respected. So the Supreme Court is increasingly has taken an increasingly strong and strident position, or politicized position, in defending Brazilian institutions, and also we see the limits of the Brazilian Supreme Court. Right now, there is a yet unresolved controversy over a Bolsonarista deputy who has been sentenced. And it's not clear that the Supreme Court, so the Bolsonaro handed down Bolsonaro handed down a pardon to Daniel Silveira, who for his, so Daniel Silveira is a Bolsonarista deputy. He was sentenced by the Supreme Court to 8 years and 9 months, I believe, in prison for his anti-Supreme Court positions. So the Supreme Court handed down a sentence, and Bolsonaro has handed down a pardon. It's not clear who's going to win in this brinksmanship, but right now it looks like it's more likely to be Bolsonaro who's going to win over the Supreme Court in this tension over what's going to happen with Daniel Silveira. Although I'm not an expert on the Brazilian Supreme Court, it looks like politically right now it seems to be where the political winds are pushing. So yeah, we have a complicated situation with the Supreme Court. And then I would say maybe one more piece of sort of the rhetorical feeling of the Bolsonaro administration has been this, and actually it's also been an institutional, it's actually impacted institutions, is extreme disrespect and lack of disrespect for and lack of reliance on expertise of all kinds, economic, environmental, academic, and this has led to a hollowing out of institutions. This has led to environmental protection, protection of the indigenous, all of those institutions that are designed to promote those kinds of things have been hollowed out because of lack of support for those kinds of expertise, lack of funding for science, lack of funding for all kinds of things that rely on any kind of expertise. Has really had a massive impact on the Brazilian public sector and public adjacent sector. And that's a major problem that we're going to face going forward under a Lula administration or any other.
Thank you, Professor Smith. I wanted to start my next question with you. And you know, as I developed this question, I was writing about corruption and violence, but I realized, given the extensive talk both about the Supreme Court and also about kind of the hollowing out of institutions, especially in light of appointing people who simply aren't going to have the institutions do their jobs, and the comment that Professor Campello made earlier about horizontal accountability, I realized the question is more broadly about the rule of law. How do you see the rule of law, changes in the rule of law, affecting politics in Brazil at this point?
So this is a question for me?
Yes, starting with Professor Smith, we'll go to Professor Campello afterwards.
Okay, so rule of law has always been has always been a point where Brazilian politics and politicians have sometimes struggled. And I think the story of the undermining of rule of law in Brazilian politics under the Lava Jato administration, under the Lava Jato investigations. So the Lava Jato investigations were supposedly an attempt to shore up rule of law within Brazilian politics through massive corruption investigations that were unrolled over the course of about 4 to 5 years, between 4 and 5 years. And at the same time, the Lava Jato investigations ultimately concluded, and this is a story that's only tangentially about Bolsonaro, or only to some limited extent about Bolsonaro, but the Lava Jato investigations ultimately were concluded with the sense that they had been highly partisan and politicized, and in fact had violated the rule of law. in the interest of disqualifying Lula da Silva from, among other things, interfering in politics in various ways, including most prominently disqualifying Lula da Silva from the 2018 presidential election. So we have this very complicated story around rule of law and the Lava Jato investigation, where Lava Jato ultimately ended with a sense of, I think probably a sense of demoralization, that there was a loss in Brazilian politics of this attempt to shore up rule of law and ultimately lose a lot of belief in the ability, the capacity of the institutions to support rule of law. This has only been exacerbated under the Bolsonaro administration with politicization of the pursuit of justice. As Professor Campello pointed out, the Bolsonaro administration has systematically sought to undermine any criminal investigations that could touch the family. When Bolsonaro was elected, he ran as an anti-corruption candidate, which was the obvious and necessary thing for him to do in the context of the 2018 presidential elections, where the Lava Jato investigations were still ongoing. And he, I mean, any politician on the right was going to run as an anti-corruption candidate. And he ran as an anti-corruption candidate, and there were no clear, known, readily available corruption scandals that touched him in the 2018 presidential election, which is not to say that there weren't insinuations, rumors, beginnings of investigations against him, but nothing really touched him during the 2018 presidential election. And since he took office, it has become clear his family has been involved in Rio de Janeiro politics for, the better part of 3 decades. And not surprisingly, it hasn't been an entirely clean political trajectory over the course of the past 3 decades. There are all of these various smaller, I don't know what you call small, but there are all of these various political and corruption scandals that have touched his family and that have been systematically quashed by people whom he's appointed and by political allies, from the Rio de Janeiro municipal government to Rio de Janeiro state government to the federal level. Yeah, so I would say the rule of law, unfortunately, stands weaker today at the end of the Bolsonaro administration, and in part because it's not clear who the next actor is going to be to support the rule of law. It requires, it's going to require massive systemic reforms. It becomes clearer with the unraveling of Lava Jato that massive systemic reforms are necessary, and it's not clear who's going to be able to push through those kinds of changes. Mm-hmm. And I'm super curious to hear what Professor Campello has to say.
Yeah, no, I agree with your very pessimistic view. That's true. I think that the discredit of the Lava Jato, I think there are two aspects of the Lava Jato. The first one is a discredit of the operation that led to a pushback from politicians who were really mad at everything that has been done, the good and the bad things. I mean, there were some positive aspects of the Lava Jato, but the fact is that after the discredit, all the pushback that the politicians were like just expecting opportunity to do, they did. And now it's really complicated to try to save something from whatever happened under the Lava Jato. The second point is that there was no change in procedures. I think that I started looking into, I was interested in Lava Jato for research reasons. And one of the things you notice at the Lava Jato is that corruption happened at the federal level, state level, local level, legislature, executive, everywhere. These things were institutionalized, these processes. And after the Lava Jato, what we had is that they arrested some people, and that was it. There was not a broad revision of procedures and how to change these procedures in order not to have the processes anymore. It never happened. So in that sense, it was a big failure. In terms of like the rule of law under Bolsonaro, I think on one side, yes, I absolutely agree with them. There's nothing, the president is under, there were lots of reasons to investigate Bolsonaro, from things he did with the family before he was elected to his connections with crime. If there's one thing that was very new to me in the Bolsonaro government, I expected, I would say 90% of what I saw under Bolsonaro, but the connection with crime and militias, this is very strong. That's very palpable. There's investigation going on, and it doesn't move forward because he established those, like the attorney general and other institutions to protect him. So this is very, very much of a concern. And just going back to what I said about like the defunding and changing leadership in those institutions, like protecting the environment and indigenous populations, what happens that the law is still there, but it's not enforced, because there's no one to enforce. So when we see the levels of deforestation that happen in Brazil, you see the amount of fines that were against those who were deforesting, they just disappeared, the fines. And with the disappearance of the fines, increase the deforestation. So the law is there. Bolsonaro is not necessarily a capable politician to change law. He dealt with the Congress in a very inefficient way, but he manages to have the law not being enforced in very important areas of Brazil. So I think that that was a big step back in terms of rule of law. Sometimes people joke in Brazil, if the PT knew that it was possible to do what Bolsonaro is doing, pardoning criminals and pardoning the friends, this is something that it was not in the repertoire of possibilities in Brazil, and now it is after Bolsonaro. So this is very new.
Was that a two-fingered intervention that you were trying to make, Amy?
Yeah, just really quickly about the environmental unraveling and lack of enforcement of laws on the books. This is another place where the Supreme Court has at times come down on the side of, you must enforce the law to Bolsonaro, and to no effect, which means that ultimately it weakens the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court has, for instance, with respect to COVID, at times taken the position, you must enforce the law. And if it doesn't have an impact on Bolsonaro's behavior, if you can just ignore the Supreme Court, then this ultimately becomes a weakening of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I agree with Professor Campello's comment on the relationship with organized crime, right? I mean, I spent some time studying the militias in Rio a decade ago, and when I saw that Bolsonaro was kind of moving forward with his election, all I could think of was, isn't he involved with the militias? And of course, him and his children are involved with the militias, including members of a militia that murdered a city councilwoman in Rio de Janeiro. And it's kind of remarkable that there hasn't been a greater ability on the part of the political institutions to hold President Bolsonaro and his relatives to account for those relationships. And it is disturbing when you see a high-level politician with active connections to organized crime. I wanted to follow up with Professor Campello and ask her in particular about how she sees the economy affecting the election. So you spoke about this kind of briefly in general terms in one of your earlier interventions, Professor Campello, but I wonder if you could get into a little bit more depth on how the economy is affecting the prospects for President Bolsonaro's reelection, as well as other aspects of politics in Brazil today.
Yeah, as I said, economy, we are doing badly in the economy, and I think it's not something that is particular to Brazil. I usually say, because of the name of my book and the kind of research I do, that it was like under Bolsonaro we had highest incompetency with very bad luck altogether, because of course and the world is very rare to, I don't know which economy is doing well after a pandemic and with a war. So that's really, really bad. It was really bad luck. And if he were very competent, very capable, still he would be in very bad shape for the election. Turns out he isn't. I think the one major mistake of Bolsonaro was to follow Trump. He followed Trump in many different aspects. But one of the aspects he followed Trump was to create this dichotomy between the pandemic and the economy, and to try to force people to go back to the streets and go back to work and try to revive the economy very, very early in the pandemic. turns out that Trump had an election coming up and he had to care about the economy in the last year. Bolsonaro had years ahead of him and he could have managed the economy in a better way and then be in a better situation in terms of closer to the election. What happened to Brazil is that we had a very, very bad administration of the COVID. We had levels of death that in any comparison are very, very high, and the economy is suffering, of course, thanks to that. So we have, and again, related to my research, citizens not in the US, not in Brazil, discount exogenous factors, external forces. So of course, now the inflation is a big deal in Brazil as anywhere else. We used to have, it's interesting because there was one discussion among economists last year that there was some expectation of a commodity boom. And that we know from our research and many others that when there is a commodity boom, this usually favors Latin American economies. What we experienced this time was different because there was this rise in international prices of commodities. But usually when this happens, we have, because of the dollars that flow into the economies in South America, you have an appreciation of the currency. So this allows us to do well in the economy because there are lots of exports and the agribusiness, which is a big motor of the economy, does really well without inflation of the prices. So this is what happened in the 2000s. So there was fast economic growth without inflation because of the appreciation of the Brazilian currency. Right now, the Brazilian currency has suffered a lot. We didn't manage to attract investment, and that makes perfect sense because I don't know why would anyone be willing to invest in a country where the president and the economic policy making is completely erratic. So in that sense, what we have now is that increase in commodity prices with depreciation of the currency. Now there was a little recovery in the last months, but what we experienced last year was a recovery of the prices of commodities with depreciation of the currency, which means higher inflation than we could have had because of the administration of Bolsonaro. So now we have high inflation, we have very low growth prospects. If I'm not wrong, they were readjusted to 0.8% in the electoral year. It's lower than the rest of the region as well. Unemployment is very high. So the general conditions are really, really bad and would be to anyone at this point. So we see it's just some people, lots of fear that Bolsonaro could be reelected. You just need to look around in the region in South America. There's, except for Uruguay, maybe it's been there's a very strong anti-incumbent wave because people are feeling the economy. On the other side, he is spending the money he learned during the.
So I think Professor Campello might have frozen.
Is it better?
You're back now, yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my internet is unstable. It's saying that here. Okay, if there's any other problem, then I'll try to connect the phone. But so Bolsonaro has been spending money on cash transfers and emergency help to people. He did that during the pandemic, and it was not his initiative, it was an initiative of the Congress, but in the end, he tried to take to take responsibility for that, and that had made, we saw an improvement in his popularity during the pandemic, which was opposed to every. Oh, am I still freezing?
No, you're fine.
Okay, so it was in the opposite direction of the rest of the world, that during the pandemic, all the presidents lost popularity. Bolsonaro won popularity because of those expenditures, which were massive. Right now, he doesn't have the budgets to keep up with them. So we have some emergency help, but it's much less and to a much smaller group of people. And again, with the situation of being highly constrained fiscally, this feeds inflation because there's no trust in the economy. So I see that I think the economy, it's very clear, I think, for everyone right now, that the economy is the major issue in this election. And I would say there was a major issue in 2018 as well, in a different way, because it was a huge economic, such a serious economic crisis that people were willing to bet on an outsider, even if the outsider were Bolsonaro. But in this election, it's very clear that it's about the economy. If you see the surveys, and people are asked about the COVID, nobody remembers the COVID anymore. It's not about the COVID, it's not about anything else but the economy, and the economy is doing very badly. So in that sense, I think I joke that we have to rewrite the political economy literature on economic voting if Bolsonaro manages to get elected, because all the factors are against him.
One follow-up on that briefly. How do you see the conflict in Ukraine affecting the economic situation in Brazil?
Yeah, I think conflict is bad for countries in general. If we are having like higher inflation, and if the U.S. decides to raise interest rates in response to higher inflation in the U.S., then we are in very bad shape, because this is when international capital flees emerging economies. So that's very problematic. On the other side, there's some expectations that with the rise in commodity prices, this could be positive for net exporters. I think it's very early to say that, because on one side, we have problems with fertilizers, which are, most of them are imported from Russia. And Ukraine has the impact on wheat prices. So I think that we have actually something interesting is that we have stocks for fertilizers for 3 months only. That's the level of planning that you observe in Brazilian economy. So this, I think that the immediate impact is not going to be good. Maybe in the longer term, if that's a very long war, and there's some possibility that Brazil gains commodity markets in the world. But again, wars are so unpredictable, and I think inflation is the most immediate effect, and it's very, very bad. So I have a hard time thinking about winners of the Ukraine invasion. I think it's going to be losses everywhere.
Thank you, Professor Campello. Professor Smith, I wanted to ask you about an issue which you've mentioned earlier, but ask you to go into a little bit more depth on it, which is the role that religious groups are playing in Brazil today, in Brazilian politics today, and in particular the role they may play in the upcoming election.
Yeah, so religious groups have long played some role in Brazilian politics. The 2018 presidential election, however, was unprecedented in that evangelical groups lined up solidly on the side of Bolsonaro, whereas previously the word that pundits in Brazil, both academics and observers of Brazilian politics, had often referred to the pulverization of the evangelical vote in Brazil, which is a really nice sort of evocative term that refers to sort of how fragmented and dispersed the evangelical vote had been across many different political candidates and many different political tendencies up until 2018. Then in 2018, we find this for a whole bunch of different reasons, including the rise of sexuality politics very solidly on the political agenda. We find the evangelical groups lining up solidly behind Bolsonaro. It actually, there were a lot of prominent evangelical leaders who lined up solidly behind Bolsonaro, but the movement appears, to the extent that we have, that we can trace the processes that happens, it appears that the movement to support Bolsonaro may have been even more pronounced early on among just ordinary evangelicals, evangelical citizens, and that evangelical leaders joined the Bolsonaro camp in part as a result of their own followers lining up behind Bolsonaro. So they were, in some cases, the evangelicals who ended up supporting Bolsonaro strongly in the 2018 election were really just going where the pastor following where their flocks happened to go. So will we see this in 2022? On the one hand, we have some evangelical leaders who are now very solidly in Bolsonaro's camp. People who are prominent religious leaders and or in the sort of public media ecosystem. So, for instance, Bishop Edir Macedo of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, the Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus, and Silas Malafaia of the Assemblies of God in Rio. So prominent figures such as this are very solidly supportive of Bolsonaro and are framing the election in apocalyptic and good versus evil Manichaean terms. So we will have some evangelical leaders who will line up solidly behind Bolsonaro. That's not really a surprise that that would happen. However, again, I just said early on that I try to avoid prognostication, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I don't expect the kind of solid lining up behind Bolsonaro in 2022 that we saw in 2018. So we will find some evangelical leaders supporting Bolsonaro. And I expect that we're going to find a more dispersed evangelical vote in 2022, that evangelicals may have some tendency to support Bolsonaro over Lula. You know, there may be a correlation between evangelicalism and support for Bolsonaro, where evangelicals have higher levels of support for Bolsonaro for all of the long-standing reasons related to support for the political right and opposition to sexuality politics. But Lula will be a more popular, assuming Lula continues to be the candidate in 2022, Lula will be a more popular candidate among evangelicals than Fernando Haddad was in 2018. And that's despite all of the baggage that Lula carries. I think he will still be a more popular candidate among evangelicals than Haddad was. And I think we now evangelicals have 4 years of a Bolsonaro presidency to evaluate Bolsonaro against. So he is not, while evangelicals continue to support him at higher rates than other citizens, he's not a particularly popular politician among evangelicals at looking at evangelicals as an electorate at the whole, at the mass level. So yeah, he's going to get some evangelical support, but it won't be the kind of lining up solid 70% vote for Bolsonaro that we saw in the 2018 election. On the Catholic side, we will likely see a continuity in the Catholic Church's reticence to take a political position, with individual Catholic leaders supporting, some individual Catholic leaders supporting the right, some individual Catholic leaders supporting the left, but overall an institutional reticence to take any particular position given this political fragmentation within the Catholic Church, and also longstanding prohibitions from the Vatican on taking clear stances in electoral politics.
So just one quick follow-up. I think you kind of hinted at what I think the answer is to this question, but it wasn't completely clear to me. Why do you think that Bolsonaro will have less support from evangelicals? It's the Haddad versus Lula contrast, plus kind of some inefficacy or fecklessness on Bolsonaro's part in really advocating for evangelical concerns?
Yeah, so yes. So I think the number one reason is that he's an incumbent, and that he has a track record that is not particularly strong. His poor performance on the economy, poor performance in COVID, these are issues that evangelicals care about as much as anybody else. So his low levels of popularity in general in the population are going to be felt among evangelicals as well. And evangelicals are, to a much lesser extent, tied into a separate media ecosystem in Brazil than they are in American politics, in the US politics context. And so evangelicals who are exposed to the same information about the economy as other people are going to respond to that information in similar ways. Again, they may have a tendency to vote for Bolsonaro. There may be a correlation. There was likely going to be a correlation observed between evangelicalism and support for Bolsonaro, but you're not going to see 70% of evangelicals line up in support for Bolsonaro in the same way that you did in 2018. So number one is incumbency. Number two is that Lula is just a different politician from Haddad, and we're going to see a different level of support for him, for Lula. Then I think, yes, also Bolsonaro has not been particularly good at meeting the demands of evangelicals, despite this sort of what I called rhetorical support for the ideological wing and a far religious right hasn't had tons of impact on policy, which people who are paying attention may hold him accountable for, though it's less clear because of his rhetorical support for those kinds of issues. We're still going to see the religious right lining up behind Bolsonaro as opposed to Lula.
Desmond, can I get say
Go
something
ahead.
about this? I think so. I'll give my political economy perspective. I think that and I don't think it opposes what America said. I think there are two aspects of the evangelical powers. The first one is that the evangelical leaders supported Lula, Dilma, and Temer, and they will support Lula in the next government. So this is what they are. There is a very strong part of the story of the evangelicals, that it's clientelism, and it depends on being in office and having access to funds. So in that sense, I'm not very concerned about it. I think that these guys are going to fight until the end for Bolsonaro. If Lula becomes the president, they're going to be part of the coalition of Lula. One thing twice. The second thing is that it's economic voting. In 2018, voting in Bolsonaro was an economic vote, was a vote against the previous governments, right? So in that sense, there's two vote, the religious vote and the economic vote went in the same direction. Right now, the religious vote goes in one direction, the economic vote goes in another, and evangelicals are poor. So of course, there is there is a difference between the average willingness of the evangelical to vote for Bolsonaro compared to the rest of the population, but these are poor people who haven't seen the government deliver anything. So this is something that I think there was a confluence among evangelicals, and Erika talks about that, and other scholars, that we talk about evangelicals as if they were just one group, and there are many different groups and then very many different faiths and practices, and there was this confluence in 2018 that I'm not sure it's going to happen again. It was a very special moment in which the candidate was evangelical, spoke to this audience, and at the same time was a challenger in an election in which the preferred candidate was arrested. So it was a very particular story that happened in 2018 that I don't think it's going to happen again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Professor Campello. So I wanted to change gears a little bit and talk about the upcoming Congress. We've been talking about the presidential election a lot, but of course, the ability to check a president or the ability of a president to move forward constructive legislation is based in part, at least, on their ability to develop a working coalition within Congress, which we've also referred to a little bit in this, in terms of the alliance basically between both the PT and later Bolsonaro and the center in Congress. And I wanted to start this question out with Professor Smith and ask her, about how she sees the Congress shaping up and these legislative executive dynamics developing in the coming years.
Okay, so I think the one thing we can say with near certainty is that it will be highly multipartisan. We can say this with 100% certainty, that it will be a highly fragmented, multipartisan environment. It's likely that there will be coattails for the winner. The PT is not much more popular, somewhat more popular today than it was before, but its PT has not had an incredible resurgence in popularity, at least as far as I'm aware. Perhaps Daniela knows better than I do, but the PT, so it's unlikely that we're going to see a massive swing of support towards PT candidates, but there will be some coattails for whomever the presidential winner is likely to be. So likely to be Lula. I think, and we're going to see the continued weakness of the right and rightist parties. And extremely high fragmentation among rightist parties. I think the bigger question is not exactly what the partisan composition of Congress will be, because I can't honestly tell you what the partisan composition is going to be, except that it will have a swing towards the winner. But how will the winner of the election negotiate in this highly fragmented, highly multipartisan context? we have, if Lula and Alckmin win, they have long track records that we can evaluate. Particularly Lula has a long track record that we can use to predict that he's going to work hard to negotiate with a large body of centrist parties to try to pass legislation. This would be, if he wins the election, this would be his third administration as president, and he's been an observer of Brazilian politics and highly engaged in Brazilian politics for much longer than that. So I think it's safe to predict that he's going to be a negotiator, and particularly the way we see him negotiating in terms of bringing Alckmin onto his ticket. I think he's going to negotiate. What that means in terms of things like environmental defense is somewhat worrisome. We can also predict that he's going to use the power of things like presidential decrees in places like environmental defense, and the power of the executive office in places like environmental defense, when it becomes less likely, when passage of new legislation becomes less likely. And as Professor Campello pointed out, the problem right now in Brazil is really lack of enforcement of environmental laws, more than the legislation itself. We have a lot of laws on the books which are simply unenforceable or unenforced at this moment.
Thank you. And Professor Campello, do you have anything to add about the composition of the next Congress and how that might affect politics?
Yes, I agree with Erika. I think that it's going to be a Congresso of the Centrão, which is the physiological parties, more than ever, if possible, because all the money right now is in the hands of the Centrão, and that's interesting because it's it makes perfect sense for them, legislators, to do that and spend it all. Because if we happen to have inflation and economic crisis, who's going to be blamed is the president, not the legislators, right? So they're spending it all. And they'll probably be very successful and be reelected. So you have the disappearance of parties like the PSDB and parties that had an agenda on the right, and you have this profusion of like parties that mean nothing, that have no agenda, that have no interest. They're just there to be able to exchange resources, policies for money with the government. So in that sense, that's really bad, and we should expect a very low quality of Congress people, for sure. I think that PT is very aware of the necessity of having a strong show in Congress. So big figures of the party are running for the Senate and for the lower house to try to boost their space, their chairs. So I hope that works somehow to counteract the strength of the Centrão. Again, as Amy said, if there's someone that knows how to negotiate with these people, is Lula. He has the experience, he knows how to do that. I think I'm concerned about how he will do to be able to keep support and the secret budget, because the Congress got addicted to the secret budget, which somebody asked in the chat. It's 16 billion, and it's the total discretionary expenditures of Brazil. I was checking 2021 is 96, so it's the sixth, but it's about the same budget of education, for example. So it's a big deal. It's a lot of money, and the Congress got used to that. And this is going to be a big problem for Lula to be able to keep the support and at the same time end the secret budget. So that's we're not very optimistic about the new Congress at all. But I believe in the capacity of Lula to negotiate with them. And again, that was a big move towards parties that are supported by Bolsonaro. Now, when we opened the window for legislators changing party, and some interpreted this as a strengthening of the parties that support Bolsonaro. I mean, it's a strengthening of the parties that are looking for money. They're going to get the money, but I have no doubt that even Bolsonaro's party, I think they're going to have a very hard time remaining the opposition when Lula, if Lula is elected. So I think it means a lot in terms of what's going to happen during the election, but doesn't mean much in terms of how the new government's going to negotiate, because these are all parties that need to be in the governing coalition.
Thank you, Professor Campello. So listening to the two of you talk over the last hour or so, it's kind of suggested three potential scenarios for the future. One scenario is somehow Bolsonaro wins, which it sounds like it's unlikely, but could be a possibility. Another is Bolsonaro loses, but there's some rupture, and I've detected like a little bit of a difference of opinion between the two of you on this, perhaps. Maybe not so likely, but maybe more likely that there could be more likely than we thought, say 4 years ago, that there could be a democratic rupture. Or third, that Lula and Alckmin win. So taking these three scenarios in turn, what are their implications for the future of Brazil, right? Just a democratic win for Bolsonaro, a loss for Bolsonaro, but some type of Bolsonarista response, extra-institutional response, and then third, Lula winning the next election. And I'd like to start with Professor Campello.
Sorry, can I ask about the question? Are you asking what is our evaluation of the probability of these scenarios, or how would these play out?
Well, yeah, what implications would they have for democracy in Brazil? How would they play out? Yeah. But you can add your
probability
views on the probability too, if you'd like. But I know you can't prognosticate. Neither can I. I understand that, which is why I'm not asking you to put a fine point on exactly how likely you think each of them are. Professor Campello?
Yeah, consider that we study what is systematic and there's noise. I would say that there's something very systematic going on in terms of the economy is doing really badly. And I think there's a big chance of Bolsonaro not winning in that sense. Of course, there's always contingency and we cannot predict that. But I think the highest likelihood is that Lula wins. If Bolsonaro happened to win a second term, I would say that we could definitely expect something like Venezuela style or Hungary style in terms of like him really obtaining control of the institutions that he hasn't obtained control so far. So this is very, very worrisome, and I see some analysts, fewer every day, celebrating that the Brazilian democracy has resisted Bolsonaro. We have to remember where Venezuela was in the fourth year of Chavez. It was nothing close to what it is right now. It was not a dictatorship. They had elections, and there were even less military in the government than that we have right now in Brazil. So I don't think that there's reason to celebrate that we resisted so far. If there's a second Bolsonaro presidency, I think there's absolutely no hopes for democracy in Brazil. Am I freezing again? I'm having problems with the system here.
You're fine.
Yeah, so this is one thing. The other the scenario of Bolsonaro losing and then messing it up like in Trump style, I think it's a very likely scenario. How far he's gonna get with the messing up, we're not sure, because there are lots of question marks. So the first question mark is how far the military will be willing to go with him. We know that there are groups in the military that would be willing to go with him. The question is whether this is going to be, it's going to prevail. If you think about it, the current Minister of Defense was considered a moderate, and analysts would say that Bolsonaro didn't want him to be the Minister of Defense. He was forced to put him to appoint him because of the hierarchy, right? This is the guy who wrote an official document yesterday accusing the Supreme Court, a judge, of accusing the military. So the guy is confronting the judge, and he is supposed to be one of the most moderate. So I think that the military are very involved, not only in terms of ideologically involved, but involved because there's lots of them like working the government right now, and this is going to be another problem for Lula, what to do with them. So I think that Bolsonaro is going to try. I would imagine, in principle, that he shouldn't be successful. But we have to remember that we have 30% of the population who still follows him. And it's not only like people who are being benefited by some help or cash transfers in the middle of a pandemic. If we look at the elites of Brazil, and I think this is something to be said 1,000 times, we have people in investment banks, we have people in the industry, leaders of the industry, of the financial sector, who are still behind Bolsonaro and who are antipetista to a level that they have been with Bolsonaro until now, with everything that Bolsonaro has done in terms of deinstitutionalization, of disrespect of democracy. These leaders are still with Bolsonaro. So the question is, would they not be with Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro decides to mess it up. I'm not sure. I think that whoever is still with Bolsonaro after all that happened during these years would be willing to go with him in this direction. So I'm very skeptical of Brazilian elites right now, very unfortunately, in terms of like being barriers to Bolsonaro taking power. Again, it's very difficult for a Brazilian and for an analyst and for a citizen to think about Bolsonaro saying, you know, the elections were unfair, and I'm saying here, I was reelected, and then the Supreme Court eventually says, no, that's not true. And what's next? Are people going to the streets to fight for democracy right now? If the elites are for Bolsonaro, if the military, so it's a very scary scenario. But I don't think it's a zero probability scenario, given that we've come with these elites supporting Bolsonaro until now. And if you talk to people that are close to these elites and are consultants to these elites, they talk about they are antipetistas. Period. They just don't want the PT. So if the decision to if the only choice of not having the PT is having Bolsonaro, I'm not sure how far they would go to defend the Brazilian democracy. And that's a very, very negative scenario too. And I hope I'm wrong. And at some point, he's going to be abandoned in this adventure. The third scenario is Lula being elected. I think that the PT, I still have the impression that the PT has an agenda that's very similar to what he had before. So I miss renewal. I miss when we talk about the environment, maybe because now I'm doing research in this area, I miss a vision of Brazil as this big green power that can be leading this process in the world and doing new things. And I see a lot of reaction, but I don't see much action going on. A vision. And I think that the PT is very defensive somehow because it's necessary to have Alckmin, it's necessary to reach out to the center. But as the American left, the Democrats, I think that being defensive is not very exciting for voters. There needs to be a vision, and I'm not seeing a vision so far. So I hope that Lula can manage with the fiscal bomb that Bolsonaro is going to leave to him, and this is a big deal. I hope he manages with the legislative bomb, which is the secret budget. And then that there's a new government. And I try to be optimistic, which is not how I am right now looking at Brazil. I think the possibility of a new commodity boom, if there's something long-term, which is, it's horrible to say something like this, nobody wants the war and we want Russia out of Ukraine. But if in the long term, there is a rise in price in commodities and there is a perception of Brazil as having a consistent, coherent agenda, that could be attractive to investment. And then we could have something similar to the boom that we had in the beginning of the 2000s, because it's going to be a trade boom, but a financial boom too. A lot of investment coming to the country. And this would maybe give, allow Lula to pursue a consistent government. The other source of optimism, if I do have, is that there are people on the right in Brazil, economists that were part of the PSDB government that realize the risk we are incurring right now with Bolsonaro, and they're willing to help. So if this coalition really becomes a governing coalition of people that think differently, but really strongly support democracy, that might be a coherent government, and we may breathe and then have another government that really moves forward. Because if we can reconstruct somehow what has been destroyed in the last few years, I think we are in good shape. That would be good enough.
Thank you so much, Professor Campello. Professor Smith, do you want to reflect on these three scenarios? And after Professor Smith finishes a response, we're going to go to the questions that are in the chat box. So if anybody has anything they'd like to add to those questions, please do so now.
Yeah, I've been thinking this through as we've been talking, and I think I largely agree with Daniela. In fact, I almost entirely agree with her. Like her, I think the most likely scenario, based on the economy as well as public opinion polls and everything we know about the structure of what we've seen of support for Bolsonaro over the past 4 years, is that most likely he will lose. If he loses, I think we can predict with near 100% certainty. There are not many things we can predict with near 100% certainty, but it is very likely he's going to question the results. He's been telegraphing this in advance in the same way that Trump telegraphed in advance his intention to question the results of the election. Bolsonaro has attempted to question the results of the last election. There's no reason to assume that he won't try to question the results of the upcoming election if he loses, and possibly even if he wins. So he's likely to question the results no matter what, and especially likely if he loses. The question is, what happens then if once he questions the results? And if the military decided to line up behind him and support him, I'm not confident that the Supreme Court and the Congress, that the other major, that the elected or the Democratic elites would be sufficiently strong to support democratic continuity in the face of the military lining up behind Bolsonaro, unfortunately. The Supreme Court, we've seen again that it is a force. It has attempted to be forceful in opposing democratic ruptures and democratic backsliding in certain cases in Brazilian politics, and it's not clear that the Supreme Court can't implement its own rulings, right? It takes other political actors to implement its own rulings. So a combination of Bolsonaro with the backing of the military could end up being problematic for Brazilian democracy. We have seen congressional elites often oppose Bolsonaro over the past 4 years, but we're seeing less of that today, in part because he has figured out how to govern with Congress through things like the secret budget. So would Congress stand up forcefully against a democratic rupture backed by Bolsonaro and the military? I don't know that we can exactly predict what would happen in that case. So the big question is, where would the military come down if Bolsonaro came out forcefully against the results of the election after winning? I remain cautiously optimistic, but it's, I think there are certainly actors within the military who would support Bolsonaro's claim. And we have to see where the larger body of the military stands, whether they decide to remain an apolitical force outside of Brazilian politics or to come down solidly on Bolsonaro's side. So if he loses, he's going to question the results. And then the question becomes, where do other political actors stand? Will the population come out in the streets in sufficient force as well to oppose a military coup, a military-led coup? I'm somewhat skeptical that it would be sufficient to prevent a military coup. That certainly citizens would come out onto the streets to oppose a military coup, and I'm somewhat skeptical that it would be sufficient to forestall a military coup if one were to happen. In the scenario where he wins, Professor Campello is right that lots and lots of historical research show process tracing, the rise of hybrid regimes back in democratic backsliding across the globe, that the moment of re-election of an authoritarian leading incumbent is a critical point, a critical turning point often within democratic backsliding. So if a country is able to turn back the re-election of an authoritarian leading incumbent, we often find, that things can, that you can avert the slide, but with a re-election, we often find deepening of authoritarian tendencies. In Bolsonaro's case, if he maintains support of Congress, he's going to have a lot of support for his encroachments, and he will be able possibly to continue to not implement Supreme Court rulings. And if he is adept in managing the military, yeah, we could see further backsliding. It's also likely that the economy is going to continue to go very, very badly if he wins re-election. And so the question is, how much will elites eventually line up in opposition to him because of the economy going badly under a second Bolsonaro term. I don't know how, I can't prognosticate there. As far as Lula winning, which is the most likely scenario, again, I think the economy is going to continue to be difficult, barring something like Professor Campello was talking about, barring a commodity boom, a new commodity boom, which of course boosted Lula during his last presidency, or the last two presidencies. So barring something like a commodity boom, the economy is going to continue to drag under either Lula or Bolsonaro, which will weaken either presidency. The Lula administration, the possible future Lula administration, will come in with a track record of governing with and through Congress. And also, Professor Campello had a great point that it's not clear how Lula is going to govern with this new fact of a secret budget that hopefully the PT administration would try to dismantle, but it's not clear how a PT administration is going to dismantle the secret budget. So geopolitically and economically, I think the Lula administration will enter office with lots of headwinds. I think it will also be an administration that is aware of the tools and the powers of the presidency and will use those to the extent possible to try to make changes. I would say that because of these geopolitical headwinds that it will enter with, it's not clear whether it could be another two-term administration or not. But I think it's going to face challenges no matter what. And there will be, while I'm not concerned about the democratic credentials, the support for democracy among the Lula administrative team, I think there will be just the weakness, the inherent weaknesses that it will be facing, challenges that it will be facing will weaken it and open up questions for what's going to happen in 2026.
Can I ask at one point to this question? The issue of the military coup, when we say military coup, I think most of the time, of course, given the track record of Latin America, we think about the tanks in the street. But if you think about it, the way that Bolsonaro is changing the rhetoric for the defense of freedom. So this guy that was just condemned and then released by Bolsonaro's pardon, Daniel Silveira, he had threatened directly one judge of the Supreme Court. So that's what he did. And Bolsonaro released him in the following day that he was condemned. So that's and if you read like and talk with those elites that I'm mentioning here in Brazil, many of them see this as an issue of freedom of expression. And Bolsonaro has been saying that that there is a threat to democracy in Brazil because people cannot speak up, cannot speak out. So he has like all these very crazy right-wing bloggers and YouTubers, and the guy who's here actually in the US and shows in official meetings with people from the government from here in the US. So the way that he's reframing the story about a defense of freedom, it's a different thing than to say, well, you have a coup because of like whatever communism. It's not a coup. It's Bolsonaro in an unfair election remaining in office because he was the one elected in defense of freedom of speech and democracy. So it's a different framing. The rhetoric is very different from the rhetoric of the old military coups in Latin America. So this, to me, is of a major concern. He has been changing the rhetoric to say that he's all about the defense of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of like having different opinions, and that the media and that the Supreme Court is the one that is not respecting democracy, that is going further than its own powers within a democracy. So that's very important to say that the rhetoric is very different. And think about it, when we think about a conjecture about this, imagine if Trump had the military here in the US. It would have been harder, much harder. Now think about this in a country with the history of Brazil.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Daniela,
much. Yeah.
Yeah, Daniel is absolutely right that any military intervention will be done under the guise of preserving democracy in Brazil at this moment. Also, my own research recently, an article that was recently published in the AJPS shows that Bolsonaro's win led his supporters to become more supportive of his him possibly participating in a military intervention. So I'm not sanguine about this. Yeah, we're in a difficult moment.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your thoughts on those various scenarios that Brazil could be facing in the coming months. So we're now going to go to the questions. If anybody has any they'd like to add, some of them have already been, some of the ones that are in our question box have been answered over the course of the conversation that we've had this afternoon. The first question comes from Sydney Greenfield, who asks, the use of social media helped Bolsonaro win last time. Do you think it will help him again this time? So I offer this to either one of you who would like to take this question up.
I don't know, I'll be very straightforward. I think that there was, of course, social media helped Bolsonaro. It has been helping Bolsonaro. Any experiment that you run in Brazil and you see the effects of any treatment on people that are informed by the social media, they are extremely divergent from the rest of the people that are informed by the traditional media. So this is one big thing. But I think it was overestimated in the case of 2018. Something that has to be noted, when Bolsonaro was stabbed, he was on TV all the time. So in Brazil, you have rules to limit the amount of exposure of candidates because you have to keep the same exposure to all the candidates, except for the fact that he had been stabbed. So he was in Globo, which is the main TV network, but he was in the evangelical TVs as well, Record, all the time, 24 hours a day on TV. So I think that social media is something important and has to be studied. I think that Bolsonaro still manages social media much better than the left, and we don't know exactly why. And again, if you think about it, it's the only thing that he does really, really well, which makes me very suspicious that there's someone else helping him out, because there's not many efficient things going on in the government, and this dealing with social media has been very efficient. But still, I think that was an estimation of how social media was determined for his election. I think there was a scenario that was very favorable to an outsider that could have been any other outsider, and he was on TV all the time. So I see with a grain of salt the social media impact.
Very quickly, I would add that there will be attempts to crack down on social media, and they're likely to be, or that is from the perspective of, say, the Superior Electoral Tribunal is going to try to govern social media, and it's unlikely. I'm skeptical that it will work to govern social media, given just all of the structural challenges involved in governing social media and in implementing those kinds of court orders as well.
Okay, and something, it's not a formal, it's not official information, but one thing we should keep in mind is that when Bolsonaro went to Russia, he went with the people, the communication people and the military to the Strip. So there was a lot of discussion in Brazil whether this had anything to do with like the managing social media. Telegram is very, very strong on Telegram. Bolsonaro has been much earlier than any other politician. So I think this is a matter of concern, this kind of connection that might be being established between outside powers that are used to intervening in social media and elections.
Great, that's a really interesting insight. Thank you. So Yanis Siligakis asked a question about evangelicals that follows up on some of our conversation from earlier, asking if evangelicals don't care about the distinctive values and policy preferences that distinguish them as evangelicals, why are they different as a group? And then he also asks how Lula, has Lula done anything direct to respond to the deficit the PT faced with evangelical voters in the 2018 election?
Yeah, so first of all, evangelical voters, so evangelical voters do just care about the distinctive values and policy preferences that distinguish them as evangelicals, which is to say that they are distinctively conservative on sexuality politics issues. That is the single area where of biggest difference. They also, and I guess the second area, which is relatively minor for most of the public, but important for evangelicals, is the caring about issues related to the rights of churches. Evangelicals care a lot about the rights of evangelical churches in throughout the Brazilian political sphere. And evangelicals do care about these issues. This is the source of a likely future correlation between evangelicalism and support for Bolsonaro, because they will see Bolsonaro stronger on these two sets of issues. It's just that there are going to be other issues as well that will weigh in their vote choice. And ultimately, I think the economy is going to impact evangelicals as much as it impacts non-evangelicals. Has Lula reconsidered the sexual and identity politics of the so-called left? A little bit. I mean, we find Lula, for instance, moderating his position on abortion and equivocating, given the widespread opposition to abortion in Brazil, or somewhat, in general, in general, we can say that there's opposition to abortion in Brazil. Lula's certainly equivocating there. And as far as where he's going to come down on LGBTQ issues, I don't think he can entirely distance himself from the longstanding historical position of the PT on LGBTQ issues, especially everything that has happened in the past decade. And he risks certain things as well if he were to take a more conservative stance on LGBTQ issues. I don't know where he's going to come down. I think he will probably try just not to emphasize those issues. I think Bolsonaro will, of course, try to emphasize those issues. I suspect the economy is ultimately going to matter more in this election than the fact that Lula may be to the left of the median Brazilian voter on LGBTQ issues.
Okay, thank you. So Mr. Siligakis asked two related questions that I wanted to pursue a little bit here, which is the implications of the conflict in Ukraine for Brazil. And he asked the question in two different ways. I'm going to kind of fuse these questions together a little bit. One is, how is the rapprochement that the Biden administration is attempting with the Venezuelan government potentially having effects on Brazil? Like, what are the implications of that for Brazil? And also, what are the implications of Brazilian neutrality and its posture vis-a-vis Russia for Brazilian politics, which is an issue that came up a bit in the response to the social media question, but I wanted to ask you perhaps to deepen your comments about this.
Let me see. So the issue in Venezuela, to be honest, I don't have an answer for that. Bolsonaro has always opposed Venezuela, and Venezuela is one of the key topics that in which he tries to strengthen his position as an anti-communist. But at the same time, Bolsonaro has been supporting Russia openly. I don't know if people have this notion, but even though Brazil voted against the invasion of Ukraine in the UN, after that, in other instances, Brazil has been trying to keep neutral. But the speed, the rhetoric of Bolsonaro, I was checking the other day because we had a podcast at the Wilson Center. We were talking about this. He has been saying that, like the whole story of Russia liberating Russians who live in Ukrainian land, but they are 90% Russians and they wanted to be liberated. So he has been reproducing this kind of discourse. So my concern about his proximity with Russia is that, again, we've seen in Latin America governments which are not, which start becoming more authoritarian, and sources of support usually come from Russia and from China. No, I'm not saying that it's from China in particular, it's support for being more authoritarian, but it's some kind of support for not being vulnerable to external pressures towards democracy. And I usually joke that I'm glad that Bolsonaro has taken this position so confrontational against China, which nobody understands why, because China could be a source of support if it tries to move in the direction of Venezuela, for example. But it's curious that again, as everything with Bolsonaro, it's very hard to see a coherence in this position, because at the same time that he supports Russia, he demonizes Venezuela, but Russia supports Venezuela. So these things don't make sense. What seems to me that it's clear is that he is moving away from the U.S. There was some interpretation that Bolsonaro was very pro-U.S. Bolsonaro was not pro-U.S. He was pro-Trump. And now he's moving away from the U.S. very clearly, which again seems to me very, very much of a concern. And I don't think that the U.S., I mean, Latin America has never been so irrelevant, or South America, to American foreign policy. But I'm not sure that it has been appreciated, the risk of eventually Brazil becoming an authoritarian regime in the region.
Mr. Siligakis follows up and asks if the Biden administration has requested that Brazil increase commodity exports. And this gets into the broader question of the resources available to each government, of commodities, oil, petroleum, fuels that each government can produce, and the implications of that for politics in the region.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry if I'm, you can be willing to increase anything, but we're talking about food. I mean, there's no miracle that you can do in like 1 year, 2 years. And we have the restriction of the fertilizers, which the government's trying to get away with that and find other suppliers, but it's not an easy thing to do. I would imagine that when you say that produce more, you're talking to the Arab states that have more oil to be produced if they want to, but it's not the same thing with the commodities of Brazil. So I don't think there's anything clear could be done in this direction.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask you if you had any final comments that either of you wanted to make, and start with Professor Smith and then go to Professor Campello.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to need to run to teach really soon.
Yes.
But yeah, I would say, I think I've said basically everything I wanted to say. I see this as an election where fundamentals are going to matter a lot, and the fundamentals ultimately being the economy. And I think the most likely scenario then is going to be a Lula win, probably in the second round, though it's possible there could be a first round Lula win. And that in that context, Brazilian democracy will live, I mean, it will be a good context for Brazilian democracy in the sense that we will miss an authoritarian, miss the re-election of an authoritarian populist who could have been really destructive of Brazilian democracy. And also there will be so many challenges that are going to persist no matter what, that Lula is going to have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Campello, is there anything you'd like to briefly add by way of conclusion?
Yeah, no, as Erika, I think I spoke about everything I wanted to speak about. I think, again, I'd like to strengthen this last point, is that there is a risk, a real concrete risk to Brazilian democracy. And I don't think that foreign powers and the OECD is aware of how dangerous it is and how further away Brazil is getting from these countries and moving in very different directions. I think it's a concern. I know that I've been here in the Wilson Center this year, and I've been listening to a lot of talks and speeches on Latin American foreign policy, or U.S. foreign policy to Latin America, and it's about immigration, it's about drug trafficking, but I don't see much of a concern on a switch to authoritarian regimes. And this is something that if Brazil moves in this direction, there's a big chance that other countries end up following. And that's very, very problematic, I think, for the whole world. So I would like to see more attention of foreign powers to what's going on in Brazil. It's not something to be disregarded. There's a real risk going on in this election of Bolsonaro moving in the authoritarian direction.
Can I add just one more thing, which is that this also has massive implications for the Amazon, and that elimination of the Amazon is one of the major, most important geopolitical threats that frankly, the
Yeah.
globe faces right now.
No, and again,
And-
there was a lot of expectations that the Biden government would be stronger in that sense, and there's a lot of disappointment in Brazil with respect to that.
Thank you so much, Professors Campello and Smith, for your time today and your insights. And just wanted to thank the audience for being here, and have a good weekend.